Hello, everyone. Caroline King from SAP. I'm your host this evening, and I think our guest probably needs no introduction. So I'll just say one or two things about SAP for those of you who don't know the company so well and our location. That we've been here about a year uh, in the Europa City. And I know it was a bit of a walk for some of you from the Hauptbahnhof. I'm sorry about that. I hear we are getting an S-Bahn station back here behind us, so I hope it will get a little easier as time goes by. Welcome. This is our second um, adventure with the American Academy. SAP knows is probably. I think this is really our biggest political topic these days. Is the election? Of course, it's not just something that the general public is interested in. As a company, very much between two big markets. EMEA is our biggest market, and the Americas are our second largest market. So we are caught definitely in the middle geopolitically, and it's a bit of an interesting time for all of us. So the transatlantic ties are very critical. So we're very happy to have you here. And without further ado, I will pass over to Doug Sosnik. Oh, no, that's not true. I'll pass over to Dan. I'm sorry. To introduce us, Doug, right? Sorry.
Always trying to cut out the middleman, I know. Well, good evening. I'm Daniel Benjamin, even though Caroline almost did away with me. And I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin. And I want to welcome you all to tonight's Marcus Bierich lecture. And I want to thank SAP for hosting us. I'm very grateful for that. So Americans are now facing, and the rest of the world as well, the third consecutive most important election in our lifetimes. We are weary, we are exhausted, we are tired, and we don't know what will come next. And we've certainly had enough of this. And to make it all clear and either give us glimmers of hope or give us, a little forenotice on finding exile wherever we might want to go. We have Doug Sosnik here to enlighten us tonight. But before introducing Doug, I just want to say a few quick words about the Marcus Bierich Distinguished Visitorship, under whose auspices tonight's event is held. It was established in 2013 by a group of generous donors. This visitorship honors the late Marcus Bierich, who was really a remarkable individual who bridged the gap between business and the humanities as few others. And at a time when we need leaders who can think critically and compassionately about global challenges, Marcus Bierich is an excellent role model. He was a student of philosophy and mathematics before embarking on a distinguished career in business. He was the CFO of Mannesmann, later Vodafone, and CEO of Robert Bosch. His career trajectory reminds us that deep philosophical thinking and sound business practices are not absolutely exclusively mutually exclusive. Sorry, a little jet lag there. And so he is really someone that we should think hard on. We've had a series of really distinguished individuals have the Marcus Bierich Distinguished Visitorship. They include Pulitzer Prize winner, literary scholar Stephen Greenblatt, investigative journalist Alec McGillis, and history of science Miles Jackson. So Doug Sosnik joins an illustrious group. So now to introduce Doug. I think it says a lot that Doug Sosnik is, I think, the first distinguished visitor in the history of the American Academy to speak twice in one calendar year. He spoke at the American Academy 364 days ago, precisely, and we're thrilled that he is now back. For over 35 years, Doug has been a trusted advisor to U.S. presidents, senators, governors, Fortune 100 companies, and some of the leading philanthropic organizations in the U.S. He is perhaps best known for his 6 years as one of Bill Clinton's top advisors, and he had a whole range of different titles. The one I always like best is political director. It has the ring of authority, and anyway, he was absolutely right at President Bill Clinton's elbow for much of his presidency. He is really one of the most renowned political consultants and advisors in the business. His strategy memos are always big news in Washington. They get widely circulated and looked at by friend and foe alike. They're sharp, they're data driven, they're filled with all kinds of insights, and they've been called essential reading for anyone who wants to navigate the complexities of American politics by none other than that German-owned publication Politico. So all I can say is that in an era where small things can have enormous consequences and where the landscape can shift overnight, Doug Sosnik is your man. He is also the co-author of Applebee's America, which was a New York Times bestseller. That's that explores how successful political, business, and religious leaders can connect with the evolving American community. Anyway, you probably all know, you must all have some kind of addiction issue if you're here tonight to hear more about the American election. And I have it too. And I'm really hoping that Doug is going to leave me more cheerful than I was when I woke up. So with no further ado, Doug, over to you.
Great, thank you. Well, first of all, Dan, good luck on that. I actually have several other really important sounding titles that Dan didn't mention, but what my real job was in the White House, and my wife hates when I say this, is if you ever gone to the circus and seen the guy that walked behind the elephant, that's what I did for 6 years. Anyway, it's great to be here. This is a spectacular facility. I highly recommend, if you haven't done it, that you go use a bathroom before you leave today. These are the nicest bathrooms I've ever seen. Definitely a place that you'd be happy eating in. So I want to talk a little bit about the election. We started off this election with the longest general election campaign in American history. We ended up with an election with the shortest presidential campaign in American history. And when Kamala Harris got in the race on July 21st, on the one hand, everything changed. It's a completely different race. On the other hand, actually, a lot less change than you might think. If you go back to 2023, from the beginning of the year until the run-up to the debate, that the one and only debate that Biden had with Trump in June, Trump was ahead by 1 or 2 points nationally and 1 or 2 points in the battleground states. And at the same time, Biden had a 35% job approval rating. 70% of the people in the country thought we were headed in the wrong direction. And over 70% of the people in the country thought that Biden was too old to be president now. Forget about too old to run again. But he was only losing by 1 or 2 points. So then when Harris got in, she, by the way, has raised over $1 billion. That's B as in billion. That's even a lot of money for you guys. So she's raised over $1 billion since she got in the race. She's won virtually every news cycle since she got in the race. She won the debate by around 25 points. She's outspent Trump 3-1, 4-1 in August and September. And the race is basically tied. She's up maybe 1 point nationally, point or two maybe in some of the battleground states. It's the same states that were going to determine the outcome of the election when this started in 2023. The same states are going to determine the outcome now. The same swing voters when this campaign started are the same swing voters now. So that just shows you how graphically, how evenly divided and deeply divided America is. It doesn't matter if you get indicted. It doesn't matter if you get convicted. It doesn't matter if 70% of people think you're not mentally up to the job as president. None of it matters. And if I leave you with one thing tonight to take away from this, so conscious, Danny says I'm supposed to leave you feeling better. If I leave you with one thing tonight, it's that Donald Trump, it didn't cause what's going on in America. He's a symptom of it. And politics is a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator of American sentiment. And 100 years from now, when historians are looking back at this period, they're going to want to know not about Trump said this, Trump said that. They want to know what was going on in America that led to someone like Donald Trump becoming president. So if he loses, I have no idea. I'll mumble my way through what's going to happen. But if he were to not win, the issues that he's brought up aren't going to go away at all. And listen, if Trump had never been anywhere in this, and I watched the Biden presidency, and someone said, describe the Biden presidency, I would say America first. A lot of his policy, they obviously expresses it differently than Trump, and he does believe in diplomacy. But there's this populist strand in America on the left and the right that is driving our politics, much like it is in Europe. So because we're 3 weeks out, I have to, before I get to the slides, I have to talk a little bit about the race because you won't listen to me until I get that part over with. The first thing I'll tell you is this is the most issueless campaign in American history. This is not a battle of the white papers. Trump says anything. He doesn't, it's all, doesn't matter what he says. No one believes what he says. And Harris is, she's running right now on joy. Normally when someone runs for, Bush ran for president. He says, I'm a compassionate conservative. If you elect me, I'll be that's how I'm going to govern. Obama saying, elect me, I'm going to change healthcare. These guys have not committed on anything because they're not saying anything. And so when at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what to expect, but we have no idea really what they're going to do, either one of these people, if they get elected president. One, because Trump is so unpredictable. And the other is for Harris because she's never articulated kind of a vision of life and why she's running for president. So I don't know who's going to win the election. I have the courage to tell you I think it's 50-50. 2 weeks ago, I'd have said it's 50-50. I think I give Harris the slight edge. Today, I'd say it's 50-50. I think I'll give Trump the slight edge. And I'll come through in a little bit of why I don't know the outcome of this election in a moment. But there are two things to watch in this election to figure out who's going to win. And there's one thing not to watch. So we're going through a huge period of transition in America. I think it's similar to probably what's going on in Europe. 10 out of the last 12 elections, the country's voted against who's ever in power. 10 out of the last 12 elections, we either voted out a president, changed the Senate, changed the House. And if I come back here a month from now, assuming the votes got counted, I'll tell you the 11 out of 13. So the first issue or question is, which of these two candidates is going to win the battle to be the change candidate? Because if you were in the status quo in America during this transition, you're going to lose probably. So that's the first thing. Now, Harris was ahead by 10 points on that a month ago, and now she's ahead by 4 points on that. So it really is the battle of who's the change candidate's the first thing. And the second thing, I'll jump ahead, it's not Trump. Trump's a done deal. He's got 47% of the vote. He's actually, if you talk about right now, people are more certain about what a Trump president would be like with Harris. And Trump has a lot of, people in America have a lot of positive feelings about Trump's presidency and his handling on the economy. NBC did a poll this past weekend asking, were you better off personally in your family for the policies of Trump or Biden? And I think it was like by a net of, 35 points positive for Trump. But Trump, the majority of people in America don't want to vote for Donald Trump, but they will vote for Donald Trump if they don't like the alternative. So the second issue isn't really Trump, it's Harris. Can Harris stand up to the pressure? And can she articulate a vision for the future of the country, creating a permission structure for a group of voters who don't want to vote for Trump, but are very nervous about, they're not Democrats, they're nervous about Democrats being big spenders, and they're nervous about Harris because they don't know what she's about. And so the battle there is going to be whether Harris can define Harris or whether Trump can define Harris. And so those, to me, it's the change thing and the Harris part of the campaign that's going to determine the outcome. It's not Trump. There's nothing you can say about Donald Trump that's going to change anybody's views about him. And as I said, the majority of Americans don't want to vote for him, but they will vote for him if they find the alternative unacceptable. And Harris has lost some ground in the last several weeks on the battle to define Harris because she's not saying anything. So and I'm going to show you some numbers. The two best predictors, I think this is the first one I think is true in most countries I've seen in Europe. The single best predictor now, through a political realignment that began forming really in the early 1970s with the beginning of the decline of the middle class, which first showed up in American politics in 1992 when Ross Perot got 20 million votes, long before Trump rode down that escalator in 2015 and announced for president. The new fault line in American politics is the level of education. It's the single best predictor of how someone's going to vote. Trump's victory in 2016 and his presidency consolidated that. So if you're a college-educated voter, you're much more likely to vote for Democrats now. And if you're not a college-educated voter, you're much more likely to support a Republican. And that's becoming even more true regardless of race or ethnicity. Is the single best predictor. Then the second best predictor is gender. And we've had a gender gap in America since the 1980 election, and it's gone up and down. Right now, there's a 30-point gender gap between women voting for Democrats or Harris and men voting for Trump. So those are the two best predictors of the election. So I want to get through the slides, and the last thing I'll say, and we'll talk about it, is going to be the turnout and who votes. That's why it's so hard to make a prediction right now about who's going to win, because we don't know who's going to vote. We had the highest turnout in American history in over 100 years in 2020. We're going to have a lower turnout, and I'll show you through some of these slides, I think, in 3 weeks. So I'm going to race through this. I think it's available to you after. I know we want to get to your questions. So people say, well, America's kind of down, feeling down in the dumps. The most important thing to see here is it's been 20 years that a majority of Americans thought the country's headed in the wrong direction, regardless of who's in power. You will see on the subhead that there has been an 8-point improvement since the beginning of this year, but you still see 2 out of 3 people in this country, America, think we're headed in the wrong direction. That's why you want to be the change candidate. And that's what I mentioned earlier about the elections in 10 out of 12. So the upcoming elections. So I mentioned about the education levels. So 40 out of 50 states are controlled by one political party, which I'll show you. You can see that of the top 15 states at the top who have the highest percentage of voters who are college educated, 14 out of 15 of them supported the Democrats. The only exception, as you see, is Utah. And you see on the bottom 15, for the most part, they're all Republican dominated states. And so what makes these battleground states, there are only 7 of them in that yellow box, they're disproportionately in the middle on education level. So it's not a bias to high level of college educated voters, and not a bias to low level. And that's the only reason that they're battleground states. So I mentioned the gender gap, and you can just see the numbers here going back. This is from 2000. On the top is the level of support on the margin for women supporting Democrats, and then the men on the bottom for Republicans. So you see it's 23 points in 20, and I think it's right now, as I mentioned a minute ago, it's 30 right now. I think it'll be higher on election day. So Harris has improved by 17 points since her getting in the race, but that is largely regaining the Democratic-based voters who had walked away from the party with Biden in office, disproportionately younger voters and also people of color. But you can also see a couple of things here. You see, one is she's kind of flat now on that. There's actually a number that came out in the last couple of days. She's now underwater slightly. Her favorable, unfavorable number is about the same as Trump's now, which is why it's so close. So you can see that the trend here in the light blue was Biden, who was losing to Trump. And then you see in the top 2, you can see in the most recent polls that Harris has edged up. And you can see on the second to the top, she had a 5-point lead, and this is a 2-point lead. But remember, we elect people through the Electoral College, not by the popular vote. And that favors the Republicans. 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections, the Democrats won a majority of the vote, 7 out of 8. But in 12 of those years, Republicans won the White House. So as a rule of thumb, first of all, as a rule of thumb, don't look at the national polls now, just look at the battleground state polls. But as a rule of thumb, if you must look at the national polls, I think Harris needs to probably be ahead by about 3.5 points to win the Electoral College. And this is what I mentioned earlier about women voters. It's interesting, if you look on the left, it's not on this slide. In 2012, white college-educated women supported Romney over Obama. And you can see now that Harris has a 40-point lead with white college women. And you can see, as I mentioned earlier, on the white college, non-college educated men on the right, Trump's got a 38-point advantage. So in a sense, if you look at this chart, on one end, the most Democratic strongest voters are college-educated women, and the other end, the strongest Trump voters are non-college white men. Then you sort of get everybody else in the middle, which is kind of part of this and part of that. So like white college, good for Harris. Men, good for Trump. That's kind of a swing voter. Non-college, non-white voters, supposedly good for Harris. Not people of color, but because they're now non-college, say Hispanic side and people of color, it's good for Harris. Because they're non-college, it's good for Trump. So these are kind of conflicted swing voters on that spectrum. So I don't know where we're going to come out here. I think it was like a 10% margin in Biden had in 2020. I think Trump will probably get 15, 16% of the black vote. Now, Hispanic vote has been an enormous decline. You can see Harris is 14 points behind where Biden was in the 2020 election. And this trend started in 2012. Again, because education now is more important than ethnicity in predicting how someone's going to vote. And this is just you see on the Latinos, non-college, that it's almost tied now, which is a real challenge for Harris, at least in Arizona and Nevada, which are two of the 7 battleground states, which have a high percentage of Hispanic voters. And so if I'd shown you this chart in May when Biden was still running, all those Trump advantages would probably be double that. So in other words, Trump had a 20-point advantage on the economy, 22-point on inflation, 30-some-odd point on immigration. So Harris has cut it in half, but Trump is winning on the issues and double digits. And part of this is the Bidenomics. I don't know if you ever heard of that. The only people talking about that are Republicans. But a lot of this is the hangover from people feeling like when Biden came in, their life is a lot worse financially. And for a majority of Americans have never lived in an inflationary period before, because we haven't had inflation in America since the late 70s, early 80s. And majority of Americans were either not born then or they're too young to remember it. So this is new to people, and it has a searing impact and psychological effect on people. Even if inflation's down to 2.5% now, and the United States is doing better than everywhere else in the world, and all this and that, you have like 40% of the country that is battered, and inflation actually increases the divisions between the people who have money and the people who don't. Because if you have a lot of assets, inflation is actually good for you. But whether you have a lot of money or don't have a lot of money, a loaf of bread, costs the same for people. And so it's really put pressure on around 40% of the country. And even though the numbers are better, psychologically, people have not. It's sort of like if it's a book or a piece of paper and you fold the corner, and then later on you unfold it, you're still going to forever see that crease. And inflation has that same kind of psychological impact on people like nothing else. And so this is, if you listen, the truth is, I know I'm on the record here, but I don't care. I'm old enough now. The truth is both campaigns have a candidate problem. If Trump were a normal person running against an incumbent who's done what happened during their watch on the economy, he'd be winning by 10 points. And in the case of Harris, and I can get into this later, she kind of came in late to the party, and you can tell by how they've scheduled her and lack of interviews, and they're starting to pick that up now because things are slipping a little. but they've kept her in controlled environments because they don't trust her. So the economy, you can see going back to 96 is up there close to the 55 was during the economic crisis. So this is still a huge issue and one for helps Trump. So I've mentioned several times the 7 battleground states. There are 3 up in the Midwest and there are 4 in the Sun Belt. And all you got to know is that all the polls are close. It's all in the margin of error. Some poll will come out today saying Trump's up 2. The next day, some other poll will say Harris is up 2. It's all in the margin of error. And as I said earlier, we still don't know who's going to vote. So, and this, again, I think we'll make this accessible to you. This is sort of a cheat sheet of how you get to 270 for each candidate. I guess it is noteworthy if you look at the Harris walls on the left. There are 9 different paths there. 6 of them you have to win Pennsylvania. And if you look on the right-hand side, first of all, if you see how easy it is for Trump to win if he wins Pennsylvania, but if you look at paths 3 through 6, North Carolina and Georgia, if he wins both of those, will really make it not prohibitive that he'll win, but so Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia are like 3 good states to watch to see if one candidate's going to really have an edge or whether or not it's going to go down to the wire. And this is very important. So let's see. So there are 2 kinds of swing voters. This is maybe so boring for you. I just sat here and I just talked to this reporter before I came here, and I'm saying the same thing a second time. So there are 2 kinds of swing voters. There's one we always talk about and one we don't talk about. So the one we always talk about are swing voters that don't like Trump and don't like Harris, and believe it or not, and they don't know who they're going to vote for. And they're about 8, 9, 10%. And they tend to be like, independent voters, Republicans who don't like Trump, non-college people of color. So that's one swing voter that everybody talks about. And they're important, particularly for Harris to win. But there's the second group of swing voters that people don't talk enough about, and they're actually what both campaigns are primarily focused on. And these are swing voters because it's not that they don't know who they're going to vote for. It's a question of whether or not they're going to vote. So that's why they're swing voters. And so all of Trump's effort is pulling out his vote. And most of Harris's effort is pulling out her vote. The swing 2s are much more important in the outcome than the swing 1s. So you take Trump. So if he, you look at the 3 battleground states in the Midwest, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So America's really changing demographically. We'll be a majority-minority country by the 2040s, which means that there'll be no race that's got 50% of the vote or more. The 2020 elections was the first time in American history that less than 40% of the voters were non-college whites. First time in history. But if you see here in Michigan and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, non-college whites are over half the eligible voters. And that's the whole ball game of Trump and what he's been doing. I can talk to you more as someone who's run campaigns, and I was a political director in the White House. I can talk to you later if you want about how he's doing this. But that's why Harris is really got, and I believe that in 16 and 20, the polling underestimated Trump's vote. And the reason the polling underestimated Trump's vote was that the pollsters underestimated the percentage of non-college whites that actually voted. So when they weighted their samples, they underestimated that. I think, and I'm speaking to you as a Democrat, I worry about this. I think that there are groups of voters, non-whites, particularly men, who, as you can see, are a big portion of the electorate in those 3 states. I think there are a lot of non-college white men who are not going to vote for Harris. And they're not telling people that in the polling. And I think it's a real challenge for her because I think her most viable path is to win those 3 states. So this should give Democrats heartburn. So this goes back over 20 years now. The majority, more people self-identify as Republicans now than Democrats. And you got to go back. You got to go back. You got to go back. I think into the early 80s. This chart does 92, but this is a really big deal, and this is particularly true in the battleground states. So I mentioned earlier, Harris is outspending Trump by all this money. And as you can see, this is where the money's being spent. Unsurprisingly, if Trump wins Pennsylvania, I don't know if any of you like follow sports, but like, in tennis, if you break serve, you're probably going to win. If Trump wins Pennsylvania, he's breaking serve. It's not impossible for Harris to win, but it's going to be much more unlikely. And that's why they're spending all their money there, both sides. So I said earlier, I think the Senate's going to go Republican. And I think the House is close to 50-50, although I think the Democrats have a slight edge there, but only slight. And so either, as I said at the beginning, you're either going to have a Republican Washington or a divided government. This just shows you in the House, the Democrats have more money. The reason Democrats have more money than Republicans is because they raise a lot more money online through small donor fundraisers. And so just to talk about going forward. So we have an election on November 5th. We have three scenarios that are going to happen on the evening of November 5th. Either we're going to know who won, but no one will have been called the winner. That happened in 2020. We kind of ended the night saying Biden won, but the networks didn't call it for Biden until Saturday after the elections. So one scenario is we know who won, but we don't know who won officially. The second scenario is we don't know who won. And the third scenario is that Biden wins and, well, hell's going to break loose. So we have Harris wins. And we have what did I say? Oh, Biden. I'm sleepy. It's after 6. So so we have a terrible system of like 2.5 months between an election and the new person taking office. And we have 50 states who all run their own voting procedures. I never worried about the Russians or anybody else hacking in and affecting our elections because, first of all, it's 50 states. And secondly, they're so incompetent and so poorly run that nobody could figure out how to pick a lock like that. But because it's set up that way in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, they're not allowing people to start counting the ballots. These are big states until election day. The state that has the best run election voting and counting now is Florida, because all you had to do is burn the house down to save it. So we have a complicated, nonsensical system that I think can create a lot of unforeseen circumstances and uncertainty after the election. And most Americans are, I think, underestimating the danger zone that we're in. I will say one positive thing, and I'll be brief, is Trump taking on the results of the election this year, if he loses, is different than when he was in the White House. He has fewer mechanisms outside of the presidency. But his people, I think, are more revved up now than they were in terms of fraud and everything else. And it's kind of, I don't know, you can call it a movement, you can call it a cult. I don't know what you want to call it, but there's a deep connection that Trump has with the 30% of Republicans who are MAGA. And I think whatever he tells them, they'll believe. So on closing, I want to say that regardless of the outcome of the election, people are completely underestimating how different Washington's going to be next year than it is now. Whether Trump wins or whether Harris wins, they're completely underestimating. I promise you that Trump 2 is not going to be like Trump 1. He didn't know what he was. Trump's unbelievable. He got elected president. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't have fundraisers. He didn't have a field operation. He didn't have nothing. He just did it on his own. And you can see in this campaign, like I said, this is a very well-run campaign. The only problem his campaign has is the candidate. But in his 4 years as president, he didn't have a clue what he was doing, and it showed every day. He knows now what to do running government. And he will have so much more capacity to be a so much stronger president First of all, because he knows what he's doing. Secondly, he's already, his son Don Jr. is already in charge of vetting people. They're not going to let anybody in that's not 100% loyal. And third, our Supreme Court, since he was president, have essentially given him the executive branch a free reign without any guardrails on them. And if Harris wins, first of all, it'll be a great mystery what she'll do. But she will bring in a whole new generation of people. This is not Biden 2. This is not Obama 3. This will be a generational change. And this will be people, I think, much more people of color. So it's going to be a whole new, really since Clinton, because there's a lot in the last 3 Democratic presidents, it was kind of a reshuffling of the same people. And there's a saying in Washington that's often the case. It's very much the case with both of these people, is personnel is policy. Who they put in these jobs is going to be the best predictor of the policy. And in the case of Trump, we don't really know who he's going to put in. And we for sure don't know with Harris because she's not largely kept staff over the years. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And I said before, I'll say again, we will be, I think, more divided as a country after the election than we are before. And I think that the populist wave on the left and the right, which is really the animating force in American politics, is going to be stronger in the future than it is now. So with that, I think Danny and I are going to talk and take questions. So thank you all very much. So it's 30, 40. Okay, 35 minutes. Okay.
Thank you for that, Doug, I think. And I just want to say how pleased I am that even if everything is changing, the tradition of democratic pessimism and self-flagellation continues to go strong. Thank you for that.
We call that the Democratic bedwetters.
Yeah, if someone could edit that out of the tape, I'd appreciate it. Okay, question number 1. In 2018, 2020, and 2022, Democrats enjoyed a really significant enthusiasm advantage and came out to vote in big numbers. Now, in 2020, Trump did better than I think everyone even expected. But overall, there was no red wave in any of those elections, and there were blue waves. Why won't that happen again?
Well, it might. And when you're talking about the Democratic Party's genetic need to be pessimistic, there was about an 18 or 20 point gap when Biden was running of less enthusiasm. When Harris got in, there was a surge, and Democrats became more enthusiastic about the election than Republicans. I think in the last few weeks, it's sort of leveling off right now, so it's close to parity. And as I said earlier, that's you have 7 states which represent 15% of the U.S. population deciding who they decided the last 2 elections. They're going to decide this election. 15% of the public, and we just don't know who's going to vote in these states. And right now, it's back to a jump ball on enthusiasm.
So one argument made by the foreign to you optimistic Democratic Party apparatchiks is that in fact Kamala, it is a tight race, but Kamala is doing better than the polls reflect, because first of all, the polls are fatally off every time now. I think on average 4% across the swing states or more. And that, first of all, the pollsters keep trying to readjust so that they don't make the same mistakes they did last time. And now they've over readjusted. That's point 1. But point 2, and perhaps more importantly, is that there's increasing evidence of a Republican passion for putting out Republican-funded junkie polls that drive up Trump's numbers and distort all the averages that we addictively look at every morning when we wake up. What do you think?
I think Danny's been kind of hanging around looking at the deep state.
Yeah.
Get a little paranoid there, Danny.
No question.
So I think, first of all, I think Harris can win. And I believe that we could have, because of, as I said earlier, this is the first national election since the overturning of Roe versus Wade. There have been 8 states since then, almost half are Republican, that have overwhelmingly supported a woman's right to choose and reproductive rights, and a lot of Republican states, and there was a large turnout. And there are 2 ballot initiatives on abortion in November, one in Nevada and the other in Arizona. So I think that we could, after the election, look back and have Harris have won, and say, well, it was obvious the whole time. How have we missed that? Because I think it could drive that historic level of turnout. I showed you earlier, I didn't mention the second piece, the 40-point margin that Harris enjoys over white college women. But since the 2020 election, post-Roe now, Trump has dropped 9 points with white non-college women. So I think that the polling could underestimate the surge in people voting for Harris because of choice.
Undecideds. I think it was a Washington Post article, maybe it was somewhere else, that recently said that the undecideds amounted to 4% of the electorate. Do you really believe there are undecideds? And how can anyone in the modern American infosphere be undecided?
Well, I think it's probably between 5 and 10%. And actually, it's kind of a rational thing where you have Trump. You know what you got with people think they know what they have with Trump. And by the way, a lot of Trump's policies were popular. His policy, when you look back at the policies of Obama and Bush and Clinton on how they approach China compared to how Trump approaches China, Trump is much more, we used to call them frenemies. No one's calling them frenemies now. 85% of the people in America have a negative view on China. So Trump was I think, much closer to where America is on China than his predecessors were. When Trump goes out and says, we're not paying for the defense of Europe if they're not going to pay their 2%, fair, which isn't enough, by the way. Americans agree with that. They don't think we don't think we should be paying for Europeans' defense if Europe's not paying for their defense. And there are a lot of other positions that Trump has taken that people in America agree with. And they do believe, as I said earlier, that he did a very good job, at least compared to Biden, of being a stewardship of the economy. So they don't want to, a majority of Americans don't want to vote for Trump. But if they think the alternative is worse, and they did certainly came to that conclusion with Biden, and they're trying to decide now about Harris, they'll vote for Trump. And as I said a minute ago, though, so particularly Harris has to do both the swing voters you're talking about, the 4%, 9%, but it's those swing voters who you got their vote, but you don't know if they're going to vote. That's really where the action is in the campaign. And most people in America aren't covering that part of it.
When last we met here in Germany, you made the argument that if the election is about Trump, he loses. If the election is about Biden, he loses.
Right.
And I'm curious if you still think in those terms, that if the election is about Donald Trump ordering mass deportations of 20 million people and being, kind of incoherent at the rallies and things like that, that he will lose, that it isn't all baked in at this point that, the Trump voter will vote for Trump.
Well, first of all, if I were running the Harris campaign, I would pay to have Donald Trump go out and campaign at rallies every day. I would pay for that. It has to be rallies, though, but I would pay for that. But I think it does boil down to Harris. And So Trump is like crazy like a fox. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So you may have read about how. So I'm a believer when you run a campaign. At the end of the day, if you tell me what the campaign was about that day, I'll tell you who won the day. So when Trump like makes up about these Haitians in Ohio eating cats and dogs, which he knows is false, and so does his VP, when he goes out and says that, we have a saying in America. We used to say for Republicans, they had dog whistles. They would say stuff that dogs could hear, but cues and all. Trump uses real whistles. They're not dog whistles. So when Trump goes out and says his incendiary remarks about Haitians in Ohio, he went to Colorado the other day to Aurora, which is overrun by Venezuelan gangs. And Colorado's not even a battleground state. So people say, well, why is he going to Colorado? So what Trump is doing is he's putting immigration as the issue of the day. Now, for his supporters, they believe it. And for people who are appalled by that, they're not voting for him anyway. But he's picking issues that he wants to talk about to send those cues to his voters. When he went to a black journalist and said Kamala was Indian before she became black, he was doing that for white non-college men to remind them that she's Indian and black because he thinks that's good. So this is all part of a strategy of picking the issues that he wants to dominate the campaign that day. And by virtue of that, backing into it, he's making Harris the issue.
So, or maybe you were on a plane last night at a rally. Harris ran a long video clip of Trump at rallies. So, she does want him to go to do rallies. And if he's not going to, she's going to just give a best hits list. The other thing is that yesterday, were you on a plane last night?
Mm-mm.
Oh, okay. So that he did an event in Philadelphia and danced to the music for a half hour instead of doing Q&A.
Yeah, it was almost like a seance.
What?
It was like a seance. I mean, he kind of went into the zone.
Yeah.
He was speaking in tongues.
Yeah.
And by the way, Harris, who, like I said, has basically been in quarantine. I actually want to mention. I want to talk about that in a second. She's doing a Fox interview tomorrow, which is surprising. But our system's not perfect. But there's a lot of discussion about how Harris benefited by not being in the primary, and she came at the last minute, and the short campaign helps her on that. And there are some things about that. But when Bill Clinton started running for president and Barack Obama started running for president, they were terrible candidates. The primary process made them better. The primary process forced them to think about why they want to be president and forced them to articulate it in a way that people could relate to. And Harris has none of that. She, didn't even make the first primary in 2020 when she ran for president. And, she, until July 18th or 20th, 21st, she really hadn't been out there. So she has no muscle tone. It's like if you have a great sports team and, they ran up a lot of wins and they ended up for 6 weeks hanging around waiting for the playoffs and they kind of got soft. They don't have the muscle tone when the playoffs start. And so she starts out with none of the advantages of having been forced to become a better candidate. It's really hurting her now.
But she did start out with an enormous pent-up demand for a candidate other than Joe Biden, and that powered her initial rise.
Her initial rise was powered by two things. One was she wasn't Biden and she wasn't Trump. And the other issue left a nice first impression. She was a great first date. But at some point, you start looking for more. And you just can't, spend 3 months talking about joy. And you can't spend 3 months having an assistant football coach out there just saying nothing. And so that's the ceiling that she's on right now, which is, and she never made up ground with these swing voters. That she just got back to Democratic voters. But she doesn't have hasn't articulated a narrative about what she want to do as president and an economic plan that people have enough confidence in that they'll vote for.
Okay, I reserve the right to ask future questions, but in the meantime, let's circulate the microphone. Are microphones going to? Yes. So please wait until you have the microphone. You have the first hand up, so there's no question. You will be called on. Right back there.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I want to ask you about Michigan. I had a very disturbing call with a young voter from Michigan yesterday, a young Jewish voter, apparently from this district that has a lot of Arab Americans, has also a lot of Jewish. And he was saying that there the vote will probably break both the Jewish vote and the Arab vote for Trump for the same issue, the war in Gaza and now in Israel. So, yeah, what can you tell us more? What you think of Michigan and these type of situations?
So, first of all, to tell you how old I am, I started out in politics in Michigan. I ran my first congressional race in 1981, 82, and the guy won. And so I came to Washington as his chief of staff. So I've spent a lot of time doing politics in Michigan. I think she's not the incumbent, but she's the incumbent vice president of an incumbent president. Any of the external uncertainties in the world are bad for her, whether it's the Mideast, whether it's Ukraine. We almost had a dock strike, and so anything that's bad right now. Because remember, the Biden-Harris ticket was like, vote for us. We're going to the adults will come back to government, and normalcy will come back. Now Trump will say, well, the adults are overrated. And when I was president, we didn't have a war in the Mideast, so we didn't have a war in Europe. So in a broader sense, less about like how it affects the votes around the country and more about the narrative of whether you can trust this person. This stuff is bad. Now, Michigan is unique. Michigan has been trending Democratic for the first time since the mid-1980s, 40 years. The Democrats took control of the governorship and the state legislature. We went into this cycle thinking Michigan was a lean Democratic state. I think the war is going to have more of an impact in Michigan than any other state. There's some other things going on there that are bad for Harris. Trump has done a really effective job of trying to make the argument that the Biden administration's favoritism on EVs is going to end the auto industry in Michigan as they knew it. There are 300,000 Arabs in Michigan. There are over 100,000 Jews. And these both groups overwhelmingly supported Biden in 2020. So the first issue is, will they turn out or will they stay home? And then the second part of this is whether Trump can make grounds with both of those groups. And I think there's some, I can tell you because I've done presentations with Republicans in the last 10 days where they're showing their polling, and I see all the Democratic polling, that there's been slippage in Michigan for Harris to the point that it's at best a toss-up state now.
Well, I didn't start off in Michigan, but in 2008, I was sent by the Obama campaign to talk to Muslims in Detroit in the morning and Jews in the suburbs in the evening. And they were all pro-Democrat in those days. It's a disaster what the war has done politically. So historically, Jews will vote 70, 75% Democratic regardless. You think that might change?
Well, if you look at any question in the United States in polling about anything that has to do with Israel, Gaza, support, arms shipment, whatever the question is, the single best predictor of how a person feels and comes down is age. And so if you take like support of Israel by age, youngest here, oldest here, it's like this. On any question that you have relating to Israel, it's like this. So overwhelming, first of all, on polling, it doesn't show up as an issue that's going to affect the election. But if you're a Democrat, or if you're a Jew and you look at the actuarial tables in America and where this is trending, America 20 years from now is going to be a very different state in its willingness to support the state of Israel.
Caroline.
Does it even matter who wins the election? Can you say something to us about this Republican challenge to not ratify the election results? That we do a lot of doom scrolling here too.
Well, so let's start with 2020. As I mentioned earlier, Trump was in the White House, so it's different. He's out now. But the guardrails held in 2020. And the reason they held was largely for two different sets of people. The first were the judges. I think there were 63 cases that the Trump guys filed, and 62 of them they threw out. A lot of those judges were Republicans, and a number of those Republican judges were Trump appointees. So in 2020, the courts were one of the guardrails. The other guardrails were Republican elected officials in battleground states like Arizona, Georgia, who stood up to Trump and his henchmen. And those two groups is really what enabled the guardrails to hold. One of the best ways you can make money in American politics right now is to be a lawyer. Both sides are built up an army of lawyers to litigate this thing out. And as I said earlier, I'll say again, I think it's manifestly different that Trump is not in the White House if he contests this than when he was. But I think that he has far more support now than he did in 2020 for people to believe that the election was rigged.
So first of all, I would like to thank you, Doug, for the very interesting presentation. It's extremely informative. My question refers to something that you just mentioned about the Docker strike. I have basically two questions. The first one, do you believe that this event has affected the campaign? And second one, is such an event is possible before the election, and can it affect the campaign?
Well, let me mention one thing I should have mentioned I didn't mention earlier. So it's 3 weeks until November 5th, Election Day. In 2020, 69.5% of the American public, almost 70%, had voted before Election Day. Now, it won't be as high this year because some of the Republican-controlled states have made it harder to vote early, but it'll be over 60% of the people will have voted before Election Day. I think it's 60% of the states people are voting right now. So in a sense, you asked a version of the question which people say about an October surprise. And so I always say, if you're in the October surprise business, you're better off doing it in September. Because if it's an October surprise, at the end of October, over half the country will have already voted. The dock strike, I don't think will have any impact because they settled. They didn't settle. All they basically did was kick the can until January. And the Biden administration, that's the single most important contribution to the Harris campaign from the Biden White House. And I should mention one thing, though, just to give you a better picture of the mood of America towards Biden. So Biden got elected, and in the first 6 months of 2021, he had over almost 60% job approval. And as I said earlier, Trump never got 50% for a day as his president. But the summer of 2021 was the beginning of the end of the Biden presidency. And there were four things that came together at the same time. One was on July 4th in the South Lawn, he basically declared victory over COVID and told America that they're going to go back, we'll be back to normal on Labor Day. Well, he was right about that, but it was Labor Day of 2022, not 2021. The second thing that happened was 3 weeks later was the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The third thing that happened in September was the first month that inflation rate in America was over 6%. First time since, as I said earlier, the early 1980s. The fourth thing that happened, but because of the pent-up demand, was the supply chain crises, which really was one of the biggest factors, that plus government spending, for the inflation rate that we had for 2 years. So the supply chain, America is much more sensitive now, and it's changed a lot. I remember asking my wife once, I was like, why do the French, they subsidize the farmers? They do, it doesn't make any sense. And she explained to me that in World War II, they didn't have control of their food supply. So they were starved to death. So they viewed their food supply as is essential to their lives, and they need to get control over it. So if we had support crises on the supply chain, probably would have cost Harris the election.
Go right back there.
Thanks for the talk. I just want to go back to the primary process, or the, so to say, lack of primary process in the Democratic Party. Would be interested to know your take on this idea once Joe Biden decided not to run or was pushed out, depending on how you want to see it. Yeah, there was this idea played around of a quick primary process, maybe something like 2-week, 4-week primary, and it was shut down pretty quickly. So if I was a Republican strategist, it would be so easy to even say, you know what, this democratic process is not even a democratic process with a small d, because it's just like, yeah, you could say passing on the torch. You could otherwise say, you know, she was not even tested. So why do you think, first of all, why do you think they waited so long? Do you think they waited so long because Biden really made this decision at that time? Or did they wait so long because it would make it too late for a primary where Harris probably wouldn't have low chances? So what do you think about this process that would have been, yeah, for the media, very striking, very interesting?
So the only reason it went on for so long was because Biden didn't want to leave. And if Harris loses the election, I think it's due to Joe Biden not getting out of the race earlier than the deficiencies of Harris's candidacy. In regards to the theory, so I'm also a big believer when I run campaigns. Nobody cares about process. They care about outcomes. Outcomes is about their life. Process is about your life. And I never for a second paid any attention to those theories. Those were older people who've done politics, who aren't doing politics anymore, that are sitting around fancy restaurants and drinking wine and talking about what should happen. I never for a moment thought that the Democratic Party on the 11th hour would deny a black woman the nomination, period.
So you include James Carville in that?
Yes.
Or just checking. Okay, we had some more questions. Right here.
Hi, Mr. Sosnik. Thank you for your speech. I wanted to ask you why, or what things have occurred in the last few years to make you say that if Donald Trump got elected again, he would be a stronger president the second time than the first time.
Well, first of all, he knows what he's doing. Last time he didn't know what he was doing. Secondly, he may have a Republican Congress that he controls. And, you know, so Danny and I were, he was, you know, highbrow foreign policy, writing speeches, you know, walking around in white shoes. I was dealing with the sludge of impeachment. And our biggest problem were Democrats, and Democrats in the Senate talking about how we're an independent branch of government, and we're, you know, spent all our. Yeah, I told Clinton with this, you know, the Republicans will never remove you from office. That's like Nixon. The reason Nixon was removed from office wasn't because of the Democrats; it was because of the Republicans. They went to him and said, "It's over." And I told Clinton, I said, Republicans will never remove you from office, but the Democrats can. So our whole strategy during impeachment was to make sure there was no daylight between us and the Democrats. And it was a lot of work. If Trump wins, he will control the Republican Party. They will be supplicants to him. And not the way we had it with Clinton, because the world has changed. And the third thing, as I mentioned, is the Supreme Court basically has said, as long as it's an official act, he can say and do anything he wants. So they used to prohibit guys like me from talking to the Justice Department because I'm a political guy, and that was back in the old rules where there's certain things that are sacrosanct, like the Department of Justice. Well, it's no longer sacrosanct. And I'll just say last two differences, a couple of differences between Democrats and Republicans. First of all, the Democrats care what the New York Times says. The Republicans don't. Can you imagine when the New York Times went after the Democrats for denying a black woman the nomination, what the New York Times would write about and how the Democrats would react. And then there's one other big difference. Democrats, we have a genetic predisposition to underuse power. Republicans have a precondition to overuse power. And when you don't have guardrails on you, after the Supreme Court says basically if it's an official act, you can do anything you want, and you overuse power as your genetic DNA, and you got a supplicant Congress, and you know what you're doing. That's a completely different world than when Trump was stumbling into the White House in 2017.
RFK Jr. is out, but what about third-party candidates who have caused Democrats no shortage of misery in the past?
Well, so in 2016, I think this happened. I think this happened with Brexit. So in 2016, everybody knew Clinton was going to win. A lot of people weren't that happy about it. They knew Trump's a clown; he can't win. So they thought, I'll have the best of both worlds. I'll, vote for a third, fourth, or fifth party, and Clinton will win. So Democrats have learned their lesson that nothing's free. Elections have consequences. And so there's the third party candidates this year are really down to the margins. The polling shows, though, that it could benefit Trump by 1%, which in a really close election could really matter. But they're significantly less a force now than they were when we started this election with a Trump-Biden choice, and certainly less than in 2016, which cost Hillary Clinton the election.
Didn't Ralph Nader cost Al Gore the election?
And Al Gore, yeah. And, well, anytime you have a real third-party candidate, whatever party that candidate was, so Carter. So in '80, Anderson ran as a third party against Carter and Reagan, and most of the Anderson vote would have gone to Carter, but the Anderson vote stayed there. So in '92, Perot got almost 20 million votes. Disproportionately would have voted for Bush if they weren't in the elections. That cost Bush the election. And same thing happened in 2000 with Nader. Those were all Gore votes. And the same thing happened, as I said a minute ago, in 2016 with Clinton.
Back there.
Thank you for your introduction to American elections. You talked about that when there is polling, you have this problem with some voters who will not commit or openly say they would vote Trump. Are there also such voter groups on the other side, Harris, who will not say openly they will vote Harris? And why is this so?
I don't think so. First of all, Democrats skew more college educated, so they love taking polls and answering the phone on their hard line at home and spending 20 minutes. So they love that. And there's some sentiment on the Republican side that polling's part of the deep state. So you don't want to participate. No, they're all part of the plot.
Deep state or deep south?
No, it's all part of the elite's plot.
Oh, the deep state is on the phone.
Yeah. So so they don't want to do that because of that. But I think that I think people for Harris are going to tell pollsters that they're for Harris. I think the real issue there is just whether or not people who will vote for Harris. I mean, if we were in Australia, it'd be a different election, right? Because in Australia, you have to vote. So I think for Harris, her problem is not what pollsters say, what people say to pollsters. Her problem is whether her people are going to vote.
Yeah, I would be interested in your view on the role of the businessman that showed up a couple of months ago, Elon Musk, Bill Ackman, in support of Trump. How influential, the media pay a hell of a lot of attention to what they do, but how influential ultimately are they to the outcome of the election in your view?
Well, I mean, we don't know how much money he's spending. I tend to think, by the way, money's over I think people exaggerate the importance. The higher the level of office, the less money is important, because the higher the level of office, people know more, and they're going to get their information elsewhere. The lower the office, if you haven't heard of any of these people, the money can really make a difference. Harris was raising so much more money than Trump that I thought it could have an impact. And one of the things I haven't mentioned, which I should have mentioned in this regard, is the Democrats have done a much better job than the Republicans for the last several cycles of turning out their vote. And it really got to mature. And this could be if we're sitting here a month or a year from now after the votes have been counted and Harris wins, one of the reasons will be because of the turnout operation that she has. And on the Republican side, first of all, Trump is telling people not to vote early. His campaign's telling people to vote early. And they're at events before events trying to get people to sign up to vote early. And then Trump gets on the podium and tells them don't vote early. And they have no money for that. Now, Musk is trying to come in with his money late and could have an impact on that. But I don't think that Musk. I think Musk is a sideshow. Most of when I told you earlier about it's a whole different race except it's the same race. Pretty much everybody filters everything through the Rorschach test of where they are in this division. That's why the numbers don't move. That's why it was a 1-point race with Biden, even though it was unpopular, in a 1-point race with Harris. Because the vast majority, there are two kinds of people. They either process everything through their pre-existing views, or there's this other group that hates everybody and is turned off by everybody and doesn't pay attention to anything. Now, the only reason they're more relevant now is they're running out of runway. If they're going to vote, they're going to have to start focusing on it. So I don't think Musk will matter. Although, if they could figure out how to use his money more effectively, I tell you, Trump's ads are much more effective than Harris's ads. And what his ads do is what I said earlier he needs to do, is he's running negative ads against Harris using Harris in her own words. Because again, it's the race to define Harris. And rather than saying mean things about her, he's putting out the stuff she said about herself. And that's starting to move numbers.
I saw a hand all the way back there on the side. So while the mic is getting there, a quick factual question. We see that Harris has raised much more money, but that doesn't include PAC money, right?
Well, they figured out, first of all, there's so much money. How do you, it's like when someone says we have a $3 trillion deficit or whatever, is that a lot? I don't know. I guess it's, so we have so much money now that it's really hard to figure out what any of this stuff matters. The guesstimate from Labor Day until Election Day, if you add up the Harris money and the Democratic aligned groups, and you line up the Trump campaign plus the Republican aligned groups, the guesstimate at the time was the Democrats had a $500 million financial advantage going into the fall. But, you're just throwing this stuff on, it's hard to spend the money efficiently. And they're spending it because it's not a bank. I mean, what are they going to do with the money after the election?
No, I only asked because there was this story about Trump, squeezing $150 million out of Miriam Adelson. And I'm thinking, how can he be so far down if he's getting any gifts like that?
He's the energy really with Trump is not as intense as it was in 2020. First of all, he's older. I mean, for most of you in the audience, if you think about who you are today compared to who you were 8 years ago, you might find a little difference in how you're feeling. Number of times you go to the bathroom at night. And Trump is, he's in his late 70s now. So, I mean, he's a different guy, and he's not the same guy. And he, went off into La La Land last night for 38 minutes, whatever it was. But, a lot of his small donors have died, and a lot of his small donors have quit giving him money. And a lot of his events aren't full, but they're about half full by the time they're over. So there's really less energy. There's still plenty of energy, I mean, for the people that like him. But there's less energy for Trump now than there was 4 and 8 years ago.
You've waited patiently. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks so much for sharing. My question concerns about your commentary on the vice presidents, so or the VP candidates to be precise, and to what extent you think, or if at all, that the VP candidates are influencing the election landscape, and do you think there could have been a better VP candidate for both parties?
So, well, the short answer is, with one exception, the VP candidates don't impact the outcome of an election. I used to say if you can put Dan Quayle on the ticket and you win the election, it shows you how unimportant vice president is. The exception, though, and I do want to address the two people that were picked. The exception is if anytime in politics there's a pre-existing negative and something comes up that reinforces a pre-existing negative, it has much more impact. So, for instance, in 2016, Trump was running against Clinton, calling her Crooked Hillary. So when Comey came out with his report in October, it reinforced the narrative of Crooked Hillary. That's why it had more impact. So in the case of Vance, his negatives reinforced Trump's negatives. So that's why potentially he could have had more of an impact than normal, not because of him, but because of how it accrued to the Trump. Now, in the selection of the two VPs, I think Vance has gotten his legs more, and Trump picked Vance for three reasons. The first was he's good on TV. The second is his son, Don Jr., pushed him to do it. And the third was he knew he could dominate Vance. And, he went through Pence, who he never liked and never trusted. The only reason he picked Pence was he was getting ready to pick Christie. And Christie had thrown Jared Kushner's father in jail. So in an 11th hour, they hijacked the process of Christie because of Prince Jared. And so Trump took Pence, and Trump was like, this guy's like religious and he can't cuss. He's just kind of creepy to Trump, but he took him because they said it's okay. So, and then Pence turned on him in his mind. So the third part of that was he knew he could dominate Vance and not worry. None of these guys want a vice president, by the way. The only reason they have to pick one is because the Constitution makes them. These are arranged marriages, and the marriage is going great when their interests are the same. And when their interests veer apart, the marriage is over. And almost every partnership in the last 40 years ended badly between the president and the vice president. And most of them only see each other at funerals. Now, in the case of Vance, they picked Vance before the race had changed. They picked Vance when Biden was the opponent. If they had picked a VP after Harris got in the race, I think they would have probably picked someone else. In the case of Walz, she should have picked Shapiro, but she didn't want to pick Shapiro. And in their meetings, she was convinced she didn't want to pick Shapiro because Shapiro's meetings were like, what's my role? What meetings am I in? Am I the last person in the room before you make a decision? It's like all this stuff's a pain in the ass. You don't want to deal with it. And Walz like, I'm just happy to be here. If you want me in the meeting, I'll be there. I'm going to be there. And there was some political blowback. Going back to your question earlier about Michigan, there was a pretty good blowback against Shapiro. I think because he was Jewish and because of the Israeli issue. And the dirty little secret about Pence and the dirty little secret about Harris was they were both pulled out of the scrap heap when they became vice presidents. Pence was losing his governor's race in Indiana. Harris just came off a wildly unsuccessful campaign for president. So my God, what a terrific offer! You get housing, you get responsibility. You have a chauffeur. I mean, it's a great job, right? Shapiro just got elected. He's a 50-something young 50-year-old guy with young kids, very popular governor. He had a lot to lose. So she should have picked him. She didn't want to pick him. I think she thought at the time she had the luxury of picking who she wanted. I'll tell you quickly a story, which since you can etch it out. So in 1960, John Kennedy picked Lyndon Johnson to be his running mate. he didn't want to pick them. Bobby and those guys, he picked them because he thought he needed to pick them to win the election. And he would have lost the election if Johnson hadn't been on the ticket because they'd have lost Texas. So he picked Johnson and he became president. And he didn't want to pick Johnson because he thought Johnson was an asshole, but because they served in the Senate together. But when they got in the White House and Johnson was his VP, Kennedy found out that Johnson was a bigger asshole than he thought he was. But he had that opinion sitting in the Oval Office. And if he hadn't picked him, he probably wasn't going to sit in the Oval Office. And as I showed you earlier on that chart, Harris can win without winning Pennsylvania. But I think I laid out 8 scenarios, and 6 of them require her winning Pennsylvania. So I think it was a big mistake.
I just want to remind you that this is a family network
Okay.
we've got going here.
I'm sure it'll translate.
Yeah.
Hi. Speaking of Pennsylvania, there's a suit filed in federal district court by 6 Republican congressmen to essentially invalidate overseas voting. How concerned are you about, and there have been other suits also filed along this different legal theories, but with the same goal. How seriously do you take these? What impact do you think they might have? Do you see perhaps as these suits, I mean, assuming they're not dismissed, wend their way through the judicial system, that they end up bumping against the December date for counting the votes and potentially throwing the election into the House?
Well, I can explain to you if I fall asleep, if I give you the fine print. If this thing ends up in the House, Trump will be the president because of the way they vote. So I was surprised in general because generally, particularly the military, the overseas ballots tend to be more supportive of Republicans than Democrats. The law, though, that I believe is most important about politics is what I call the law of unintended consequences. When you think you've gamed this stuff out in politics, a lot of times the opposite happens. So, for instance, so Biden wanted a debate because he felt like he needed to change the dynamic. Trump was like, well, let's do the debate. I'll beat him and we'll finish him off. Well, they really finished him off. I mean, Trump wanted to run against him, right? So the whole strategy was based on that. So I think the law of unintended consequences could happen here. My guess is, and it's just a guess, is that they won't block it and won't stop it. But every state has their own rules. Like some states, you got to mail it by a certain date. Some states, you got to have it in possession by a certain date. So there are all these different rules and interpretations of these ballots. So even if you don't have something at the national level, you're going to see in the 7 battleground states, you're going to see, and remember, Republicans have really made it more difficult in North Carolina and Georgia of the battleground states. It's going to be much more difficult now for ballots being counted and for the ability for people to contest the validity of those ballots in those 2 states in particular.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. Doug, I'm reminded of the great American political journalist H.L. Mencken, who was fond of saying things like, political conventions are more fun than a massacre. You take fun in all this, don't you? I mean, I guess you have to if you're going to do it day in and day out.
Is that a question?
That's a question, yeah.
So there are 3 rules when you give a speech. The first is you got to show up on time. True, right? The second is you're not supposed to offend the host. I think I was doing okay until towards the end.
Yeah.
But the third is you want to have people feel a little more optimistic when they leave than before they came, which I would say I have
You failed.
a little work to do. But I will only talk about my country for a moment. And I'm actually extremely optimistic about the future of America going forward, but not in the short term. We started in, as I said earlier, at the beginning of the century. We're going through the biggest transition in America, to the world. Biggest transition since the late 1800s. We went from an agrarian society to a manufacturing society. We're 25 years into it right now. In the short term, there are a few winners and a lot of losers. And we're an evenly divided country with these tribes, and it's all fighting basically the same battle since the 1960s. But I'm confident and optimistic about the future of America because the baby boomers, who I'm part of, who squandered America's promise, who squandered everything that we were able to do about not only winning the war, but also the unparalleled prosperity that the United States had for the second half of the last century. My generation has squandered all of that. But we're going to die off. And while everyone likes to joke about, Gen Zs and millennials living in their parents' basements and sitting all day in their pajamas, they're much more like the greatest generation in terms of their sense of community and their values, and they think everyone sucks. No, Democrats and Republicans, they've seen nothing their whole life but institutions failing them, and have seen what institutions did to their families. So they know if they don't take life in their own hands, nothing is ever going to get done. And young Republicans, 45 and under, have a lot more in common with young Democrats, neither of which, by the way, like either party. Issues like gun control, the environment, sense of social issues and community. So this generation is now the largest population group in America, but only by the end of this decade will it be the largest voting group. And I think by the end of the decade, they're going to start beginning to take power over in our country. So I think we've been in a cul-de-sac for 2.5 decades. And I think we're stuck in that cul-de-sac probably for another 5, 8 years or whatever. But we're going to get out of that. And so we're going to have a different level type of leadership in our country. People are going to come together because they're sick of all this stuff. I'll take my country's position about the rule of law, about where, our sort of entrepreneurial gene that's unmatched in the world. We have the greatest universities in the world. We're ahead in AI. And so I believe we are really well poised as a country to go back closer to what we did in the last century, but only after we've changed leadership in our country. And it's a generational change, but it's not imminent. It's not today. It's not tomorrow. It's more like the beginning to middle of the next decade that worm is going to turn.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm glad I teed you up for that optimistic note at the end.